my name is Callie Saunders, and for my Trend Report issue, I have decided to study poverty and reading comprehension in the middle school classroom. So, for my literature review, I read a book called Read Aside by Kelly Gallagher, who is an educator in Los Angeles, and he came to the conclusion that students from poverty, by the time they get to kindergarten, know approximately 32 million fewer words than their upper class peers. So this is by the time they reach kindergarten. And you're probably wondering, what implications does this have in the middle school classroom? Well, a further study showed that by the time students reach middle school, if they're coming from low-income families, they're typically reading 3 years behind grade level. And this has drastic implications for reading comprehension, the ability to acquire language, and even students' overall attitude about reading. So it's really, really important that middle school educators know how to approach reading in the classroom, especially when they're dealing with students from poverty. Students who are already forced to overcome a 32 million word deficit. As we know, as we've been studying junior high and middle school, there is a very autonomous nature of middle school. And because we're trying to put such a strong emphasis on independence, there's very little emphasis on reading comprehension. So this means that a lot of times students are just handed a book and expected to read it cover to cover. Typically, their formative assessment for such a book would be some sort of comprehension quiz, which in theory is a great way to test reading comprehension, but when you've got students who are already coming from such a language deficit, it actually builds the achievement gap a lot further. So, when you're dealing with students from poverty, we know that they often have fewer reading comprehension skills. We'll talk about the reasons why in a little bit later. But this impacts reading, writing, speaking, thinking, and then as you get into the future, it starts to influence test taking and college acceptance. And so if students don't have a strong foundation of reading comprehension established in middle school, then it's actually setting them up for failure later in life. Most commonly, they also grow to hate reading. A study done said that middle school students, on average, hate reading. Not a whole lot of statistics there, it's really just the facts. And I think that that's because there's an overall neglect of teaching reading comprehension at the middle school level. We expect students to get to the grades 6 through 8 and know how to understand what they're reading, but unfortunately that's just not often the case. And with students from poverty, they're coming from, like we've talked about, word poverty or language acquisition deficit. And so it perpetuates the achievement gap between low-income students and their higher income peers. So why does this achievement gap happen? Well, most of the time, students that are coming from poverty have less access to reading materials at home. A lot of times there are not a lot of books in the household, and if they are, they're not books that students would typically be interested in. Also, even neighborhood libraries in lower income areas will have fewer books and less opportunities for students to get out and get reading. Also, students from poverty oftentimes have a lack of social capital. So if you're just assigning reading to be done at home, then students might not have the opportunity to ask a parent for a word they don't understand or look up a definition or something like that. So they're coming to middle school with a weak reading foundation. That's started since the time they were in kindergarten when they discovered the 32 million word deficit, and this just continues to grow over time. And so by the time we get to middle school, students following that autonomous nature are left on their own to read, and so they're expected to already know how to read independently. So really the achievement gap does start at birth. You have a disadvantaged child, the cumulative vocabulary of a 3-year-old child knowing about 500 words, where a child from a professional family who's been read to and who's been talked to with higher level vocabulary, they have over double the amount of words from students from poverty or disadvantaged children. So this is a gap that we have to be aware of at the middle school level. How does this impact students from poverty? Well, these students are going to have an extreme aversion to reading because a lot of times they don't know how. They feel like they're falling behind their peers. They don't want to read aloud in class. What a lot of teachers do is sustain silent reading, which would be 10 to 15 minutes of just quiet reading time at the beginning of a class period. Seems like a good idea, but there's little to no accountability of the reading material, and because there's so little guidance with this practice, a lot of times students who don't understand the reading are just left staring at blank pages, while students who do understand the reading are able to just soar, and they fly right through it, and they read book after book, and so there's a gap that's being formed there as well. We know that middle school is a time when self-esteem is of great importance and oftentimes is really low for students in general. But especially when you're dealing with students from poverty who might not know how to read, if they're placed in a reading classroom and expected to have to read out loud or to just whip out reading comprehension tests, it's going to be a real struggle for them. What teachers are doing right now is trying to emphasize independent reading. This is a good thing. So they're handing students a book, hopefully trying to foster some interest or excitement about reading, maybe assigning book clubs or any sort of, as I said, sustained silent reading practice. But unfortunately, handing students a book and expecting them to understand with minimal guidance or instruction is not a good thing when you're dealing with students from poverty who might already struggle with reading comprehension. So what teachers can be doing to close the gap, based on my research, is a guided independent reading practice. The same author of Read Aside that I mentioned earlier, Kelly Gallagher, teamed up with a woman named Penny Kittle. Both teachers have been teaching for over 30 years in the language arts classroom, and they really emphasize the importance of regular reading conferences. So it might take a lot of time out of your day to be meeting with students and discussing what you're reading, but at least you have a better grasp of how they're understanding and comprehending the material. Also placing a strong emphasis on learning vocabulary. Becoming aware of the word poverty deficit is essential because then we can start building in vocabulary practices to overcome that. So doing weekly vocabulary integration or stopping during reading to define a word is going to be really, really essential. Also having small group book clubs with monitored discussion, so that means you as a teacher are walking around and being in proximity of the students, making sure that they are understanding and adequately comprehending the material, and then even teaching lessons about reading comprehension. Walking through the process with students and having them slow down, take time to grasp and digest and pick apart the text that they're reading is going to be really good. And then a lot of times once students get to middle school, we stop reading aloud to them. Like I said, we're trying to put an emphasis on autonomy. We want them to be able to do things for themselves. Unfortunately, we have students who cannot read independently very well. So reading aloud is going to be valuable through all grade levels. So don't think that that's going to be a waste of time at the middle school level. Another thing you can do, word flood. Make sure that books are being passed around frequently. Try to send books home if it's at all possible. And then get parents involved in the reading too, because the best way to build a reading community is to let it start at home. And then finally, my main point here is let's stop pushing autonomy to the point of abandonment. Yes, we do want our students to be independent readers, but if they're coming from a background of poverty and a deficit in language acquisition, then we cannot just abandon them and throw them into the wild and say good luck reading. As middle school educators, we have to be willing to come alongside our students and ensure that they are grasping the reading material and overcoming the 32 million word deficit. And ultimately, this will hopefully help students get caught up so that we do not have students from poverty reading 3 years behind grade level. In conclusion, let's teach reading comprehension at the middle school level, especially when we're dealing with students from poverty, not neglecting the gap that they have and not forcing them to figure things out on their own. Remember that they're starting out in a reading deficit, and we only dig the hole deeper if we don't slow down and teach them how to read. Middle school is not too old to learn reading comprehension levels, and if we as teachers are willing to invest that time, it can make a huge impact that will benefit them for life. Thank you for listening.